The video footage
We
shook
need
as
to
the
address
woman
the
filming
elephant
from
in
her
the
Honda
room.
Accord
This
adjusted her
cannot
grip on her
continue as it
iPhone.
has.
Thank you
August
so much
heat
for your
rippled
help. How
off
much
the
do we owe
I-80
you?
No problem, ma'am.
asphalt
This
in
should cover the
waves
initial
that
look over. We'll
distorted
need to assess further
everything
once the engine
beyond
cools down.
50 feet
Ma'am?
shimmering air that turned the backed-up traffic into a mirage of brake lights and frustration. 3 miles of standstill cars baking under a California sun that had pushed past 100 degrees by noon. The woman kept her camera steady on the scene unfolding 20 yards ahead. An elderly couple stood beside their smoking Honda Civic, the man's weathered face creased with worry as he lifted the hood to reveal steam billowing from the engine compartment. His wife held a flip phone, ancient, probably no data plan, trying to shield it from the sun with one trembling hand. That's when the work truck pulled onto the shoulder. Navy blue Ford F-150 with Morrison's Auto Repair painted in white letters on the door, rust spots blooming around the wheel wells like the truck had earned every mile. The driver stepped out tall, maybe 6'2". Dark hair falling across his forehead, wearing jeans and a gray t-shirt already stained with oil from whatever job he'd finished before this. He grabbed a red toolbox from the truck bed and walked straight toward the smoking Civic without hesitation. No phone call to check if he had time. No calculation about whether stopping would cost him something. Just direct movement toward people who needed help. The woman filming zoomed in as he reached the couple. The elderly man's mouth moved, probably explaining what had happened, maybe apologizing for the trouble. The mechanic shook his head, already kneeling beside the front bumper, setting his toolbox on hot asphalt that had to be burning through his jeans. 2 hours. The timestamp on the video proved it. 2 hours in heat that made the air feel solid sweat soaking through the mechanic's shirt until it clung to his back and shoulders. He worked methodically, checking hoses, testing connections, disappearing under the hood until only his legs were visible. Twice he walked back to his truck for additional tools. Once he poured water from his own cooler into the Civic's radiator, sacrificing his drinking supply. Cars crawled past in the one open lane. Drivers stared. Some honked their approval. Most just kept going, grateful the delay wasn't their problem. Finally, the mechanic straightened, wiping his hands on a rag that was beyond saving. He spoke to the elderly couple, words the video couldn't capture, but his body language made clear. The car was fixed. Temporary repair, but enough to get them somewhere safe. The elderly man reached into his back pocket and pulled out a wallet. His hands shook as he extracted bills, maybe $200, judging by the thickness. Everything he had, probably. He held it toward the mechanic with the desperate gratitude of someone who knew exactly how close they'd come to being stranded without options. The mechanic looked at the money for 3 seconds. Then he pushed the man's hand back, gently shaking his head. His mouth formed words the camera barely caught, but the woman filming whispered them through her tears. "Just glad you're safe. Get that looked at properly in Fairfield." The elderly couple tried again. The man's wife stepped forward, adding her voice to her husband's. The mechanic kept refusing, kept smiling, kept treating them like the money was an insult to something bigger than a transaction. Eventually, he climbed back into his F-150 and pulled away, leaving the couple standing beside their running Civic, looking like they'd witnessed something rare. The video ended there, but the woman who'd filmed it posted it that night with a caption that went viral by morning. "There are still good people in this world." 3.2 million views in 72 hours. Comments flooded in about faith in humanity restored, and real heroes don't wear capes, and this is what America should be. News stations reached out. Morning shows wanted interviews. The mechanic's phone number visible on his truck door in the video started receiving calls from people who wanted to pay him. Thank him. Hire him for their own repairs. Jake Morrison ignored every single one. He was already under another car by the time the video hit 1 million views, doing what he'd always done, fixing what was broken. Charging what was fair, going home at the end of the day with grease under his fingernails and the quiet satisfaction of work done right. 3 months later, on a Friday evening in November, he was finishing a transmission job on a 1998 Honda Civic when the bell above Morrison's Auto Repair chimed for the last time that day. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered like they'd been threatening to die for the past decade. One had been out completely for 6 weeks. Jake kept meaning to replace it, but somehow never found the time. The shop smelled like motor oil and old coffee, the pot on the corner desk down to its last inch of sludge that had been sitting there since 10 that morning. Concrete floor stained with decades of leaks that no amount of scrubbing would ever fully erase. An American flag hung on the back wall above a calendar from the Giants' 2014 World Series run. Jake didn't look up from the engine. His hands were elbow-deep in the Civic's inner workings fingers, tracing the problem he'd been chasing for the past hour. The car belonged to a high school teacher in East Oakland who'd already been quoted $1,200 at a dealership for a repair Jake knew would cost half that. Tony emerged from the back office, wiping his hands on a rag that matched the futility of Jake's. 53 years old, with 2 kids at San Jose State, and the kind of face that showed every mile of the years he'd spent turning wrenches. He'd worked for Jake since the shop opened 6 years ago. Reliable, skilled, understood that fast and right weren't the same thing. "You turning away customers again?" "We're closing in 20 minutes. Jake's voice came muffled from under the hood. The bell meant someone had walked in, but the clock on the wall read 5:45, and he'd already put in 11 hours. "If it's not an emergency, they'll have to come back Monday." Real quick doesn't exist. Done right or not done at all. Silence from the front of the shop. Not the usual response. Most people either left or started explaining why their situation qualified as urgent. This person just stood there waiting with a patience that made Jake curious enough to finally look up. The woman in his doorway didn't belong. That was the first thought anyone would have, not cruel, just observational fact. She wore a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than Jake's monthly rent on the apartment above Mrs. Chen's restaurant next door. Dark jeans that fit like they'd been tailored specifically for her frame, which they probably had been. Heels that put her close to 5'10", clicking against oil-stained concrete that had never seen footwear like that. Her hair was pulled back in a way that looked effortless, but Jake had learned enough from watching Emily get ready to know that effortless usually took work. She held herself like armor. Shoulders back, chin level, eyes steady, behind the kind of control that came from years of practice. But Jake had spent enough time reading people customers lied about what they'd done to their cars, had to learn to see past what they showed you to notice the tremor in her hands. Slight, the kind you'd only catch if you were paying attention. Her eyes, dark brown and sharp, held something he recognized too well. Desperation. The specific kind that came from being surrounded by people, but utterly alone. Tony had disappeared back into the office, probably sensing this wasn't a conversation about spark plugs. Jake straightened, tossing his rag onto the workbench. He was tall, just over 6 feet, with the kind of build that came from actual labor rather than gym memberships. Dark hair, perpetually messy face, unshaven because he'd stopped caring about that kind of thing years ago. His clothes carried the evidence of a long day fixing other people's problems. "Then what are you here for?" The woman took a breath, and Jake watched her make a decision. Whatever she was about to say, she'd been rehearsing it. Probably practiced in her car on the drive over. Her knuckles whitened slightly around the designer purse she carried. "My name is Madeline Sterling." Her voice was controlled, boardroom ready. The kind of voice used to giving presentations to people who mattered. "And I need to hire you for the weekend." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Lady, I don't know what kind of mechanic work you think requires a weekend, but I don't need a mechanic." The words cut through his sentence, cleanly surgical. "I need a boyfriend." The shop fell silent except for the hum of dying fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic on the street outside. Jake stared at her. Then he laughed, short, sharp sound with no humor in it. "You've got the wrong place." He turned back to the Civic, dismissing her. "Whatever this is, I'm not interested." "Please." The word came out softer than she'd intended. Jake heard her flinch at her own vulnerability. He paused, hands on the Civic's hood, not looking at her, but listening. "Just hear me out. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." Something in her voice made him stop. He'd heard a lot of things in his 34 years. Lies from customers trying to avoid paying for damage they'd caused. Promises from people who meant well but couldn't follow through. Threats from the occasional drunk who didn't like being told the repair would cost more than they wanted to hear. Pleas from the elderly couple on I-80 when they'd tried to pay him. But there was a quality to her desperation that felt different. Honest, maybe. Or maybe just broken in a way he understood. He turned around, crossed his arms, leaned against the Civic. 5 minutes. Talk. Madeline Sterling took another breath and gathered herself like someone preparing for battle. "I come from a family that measures worth in dollars and legacy. Every year we have a gathering 3 days at the family estate in Napa Valley. Everyone brings their partners, shows off their achievements, quietly tears each other apart under the guise of civility. I've attended alone for the past 5 years. Jake didn't say anything, just listened, reading her body language, the way she shifted her weight every 15 seconds, the way her right hand kept adjusting the strap of her purse even though it was already positioned correctly. Every single time I'm reminded that despite everything I've accomplished professionally, I'm considered incomplete because I don't have someone standing next to me." Her voice steadied, shifting into what Jake recognized as a business pitch. "This year I can't do it alone again." And now her voice was steadier, like she was presenting a case. "I don't need romance. I don't need affection. I just need someone who can stand in a room full of people who will judge every word, every gesture, every breath, and not crumble under it. Someone real." "And you think I'm that someone?" Jake kept his voice neutral. "You don't know anything about me." "Actually, I do." That made Jake go still. Madeline reached into her purse, expensive leather thing that probably had its own insurance policy, and pulled out her iPhone. A few taps later, she turned the screen toward him. Jake recognized the video immediately. 3 months old now, but still circulating on social media whenever someone needed to restore their faith in humanity. The view count had passed 3 million last he'd checked, not that he was checking. He'd stopped looking after the first week when his phone wouldn't stop ringing with media requests and strangers wanting to know his life story. The footage showed him on I-80 100-degree heat spending 2 hours fixing a Honda Civic for an elderly couple who'd been stranded. Showed him refusing their money. Showed him treating them with dignity when he had absolutely nothing to gain from it. "I saw this video the day it was posted." Madeline's voice had gone quieter, more genuine. She put her phone away and met his eyes. "I watched you spend 2 hours in 100-degree heat helping complete strangers. I watched you refuse money from people who clearly didn't have much to give. I watched you treat them with dignity and kindness when you had absolutely nothing to gain from it." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "That's why I'm here. Because I need someone who understands that kindness isn't a transaction. Someone who won't be impressed by wealth or intimidated by my family's status. Someone who will just be real." Jake studied her for a long moment. The shop was quiet except for the buzz of those dying lights and the distant sound of traffic on the street outside. On the desk in the corner office, visible through the doorway, a photograph sat in a simple frame. A young woman with a bright smile standing in front of this same shop on opening day 6 years ago. American flags in the background, a mayor he'd never met cutting a ribbon. Emily. The reason he'd opened Morrison's Auto Repair in the first place. The reason it had felt like betrayal to care about anything else after she was gone. "What's the catch?" he asked finally. "No catch. I'll pay you." "No." The word came out harder than he'd intended. "If I do this, and that's a big if, it's not for money." Madeline blinked, genuinely surprised. "I don't understand." I don't need your money. Jake's voice was flat, factual. I've got enough to pay my bills and keep this place running. That's sufficient. If I agree to this, it's because I choose to, not because you paid me to. For the first time since she'd walked into his shop, Madeline Sterling looked caught off guard, not calculating his angle or reading his intentions. Just surprised. Genuinely surprised. Why would you choose to? Jake considered the question. Why would he? His life was simple, predictable. Work from 7 to 6 5 days a week. Sometimes Saturdays when the backlog got heavy. Go upstairs to the apartment that overlooked the street. Heat up whatever Mrs. Chen had left in a container outside his door. Fall asleep, watching whatever game was on. Wake up and do it again. Keep his head down, his hands busy, his heart carefully locked away where it couldn't be damaged again. Getting involved in some wealthy woman's family drama was the exact opposite of simple. But there was something in her eyes, that specific kind of loneliness that came from being surrounded by people who looked at you but never actually saw you. He'd felt that way at Emily's funeral, standing in the rain, while people offered condolences that all sounded the same. While her family from back east had sized him up and found him wanting the mechanic who'd convinced their daughter to stay in Oakland instead of returning to Connecticut where she belonged. He'd felt that way for 6 years, until it became normal, until a loan stopped feeling like a problem and started feeling like safety. Because, he said slowly, picking up the photograph from his desk and looking at Emily's face, I think you're telling the truth. And I think you actually need help. Real help. There's a difference. He set the photo down gently, turning back to face Madeline. My uncle, the man who raised me after my parents died in a car accident on Highway 50 when I was 10, he taught me that integrity is doing the right thing when nobody's watching. He fixed cars in Sacramento for 40 years. Never once overcharged someone just because he could. Never turned away someone who genuinely needed help, even if they couldn't pay. Jake could still see his uncle's shop smaller than this one, could still smell the specific combination of oil and coffee and the cigars his uncle smoked on lunch breaks, could still hear his voice. Some debts can't be paid with money, Jake, only with time and attention and giving a damn. I lost someone who mattered. Jake's voice had gone quieter. I spent 6 years keeping everyone at arm's length. You walking in here, I recognize what I see in your eyes. You're surrounded by people who look at you but never actually see you. Madeline's armor cracked, just slightly but enough. Yes. The word came out barely above a whisper. Jake watched a tear track down her cheek before she caught it, wiping it away with the back of her hand like she was angry at herself for the display of weakness. So, you'll do it. One condition. Jake's voice was firm again. If at any point during this weekend I think you're playing me, using me for some game I don't understand, or putting on a show for people who don't matter, I walk. No explanation, no second chances. I just leave. That's fair? And no money. Jake repeated it like she might not have heard him the first time. Not a dollar. This isn't business. Then what is it? Jake picked up his rag again, more out of habit than need. Anything to give his hands something to do. I guess we'll find out. When's this thing happening? Next weekend, Friday through Sunday. The estate is about 2 hours north of here in Napa Valley wine country. Of course it is. Jake's voice was dry, then louder. Fine, I'll need your number to coordinate details. They exchanged information, and Jake found himself looking at a contact that simply read Madeline Sterling with a 415 area code. San Francisco. No company name, no title. Just a name and a number. Thank you. The relief in Madeline's voice was palpable, like she'd been holding her breath since walking through his door. You have no idea what this means to me. Probably not, Jake agreed. But I'm starting to get the picture. Madeline turned to leave, her heels clicking against concrete. She paused at the door, one hand on the frame. "That couple you helped on the highway, did you ever find out what happened to them?" Jake shrugged. "Never asked. Wasn't helping them, so I'd get a story out of it." Madeline smiled. A real smile this time, not the polished version she'd walked in with. The armor was still there, but he could see the person underneath it now. "No, I don't suppose you were." After she left, Jake stood in his empty shop for a long time, staring at his phone. The smart thing would be to text her right now and cancel. Whatever mess she was walking into, it wasn't his problem. He had his own ghosts to manage, his own wounds that still hadn't fully healed. But he didn't cancel. Instead, he went back to the Honda Civic and finished the job he'd started. Found the issue-worn clutch that would need replacing eventually, but could wait another few months if the teacher was careful. Wrote up an invoice for $400 instead of the $800 it would have cost at a dealership. Left a note about bringing it back in spring for the clutch work. Then he locked up the shop, climbed the stairs to his apartment, and tried not to think about cream-colored blazers and eyes that held too much loneliness for one person to carry alone. The week passed in the rhythm Jake had built his life around. Monday through Friday, 7 to 6. Oil changes and brake repairs and the steady accumulation of work that paid the bills and kept 3 employees fed. Marcus replaced a timing belt on a Toyota Camry. Jenny diagnosed an electrical problem in a Subaru Outback. Tony handled the walk-ins while Jake focused on the bigger jobs. He didn't hear from Madeline again until Thursday evening, when his phone buzzed with a text. Short, direct, the kind of message from someone used to coordinating schedules. "Picking you up tomorrow at 3 p.m. Pack business, casual clothes for dinners, something comfortable for daytime. The family dresses for evening meals." Jake looked down at his phone, then at his closet. He'd moved into this apartment 6 years ago and hadn't updated the wardrobe since. Jeans, work shirts, and exactly 2 button-downs he kept for occasions that required looking slightly less like a mechanic. A sports coat that Emily had convinced him to buy for her cousin's wedding, shoved in the back and probably 3 inches too tight across the shoulders now. He texted back, "Define business casual." The response came 30 seconds later. "Do you own a blazer?" Jake, number Maddie. "I'll handle it. What's your size?" Jake stared at his phone. The smart thing, the independent thing, would be to refuse. But she had a point. He'd agreed to help her survive a weekend with her family, and showing up looking like he'd just crawled out from under a car wouldn't help anyone. About 44. Long 34. By 34 pants. Don't go crazy. "Maddie, I'll try to restrain myself. See you tomorrow." Friday afternoon arrived with the kind of November weather that made people forget California had seasons. Clear sky temperature in the low 70s, the kind of day that felt like a gift. Jake closed up the shop at 2:30, leaving Tony in charge of anything that came through the door. He'd showered, changed into clean jeans and a navy Henley that at least didn't have oil stains, and thrown a duffel bag together with what he hoped would pass for appropriate weekend attire. At exactly 3 o'clock, a black Mercedes GLS pulled up in front of Morrison's Auto Repair. Jake was already outside locking the front door when Madeline stepped out of the driver's seat. He did a double take. Gone was the boardroom armor from last week. She wore dark jeans, a soft gray sweater, and ankle boots that looked expensive but actually practical. Her hair was down, falling in waves past her shoulders. She looked younger, more real. More like someone he might actually know instead of someone from a world he'd only ever seen in movies. "You look different." "So do you." Her eyes tracked to his clean clothes with something like approval. "I wasn't sure you owned anything without grease stains." "I have layers." Jake's voice was dry as he tossed his bag in the back seat. "Some of them don't even involve motor oil." The drive north started quiet. Madeline navigated through Oakland traffic with the kind of precision that spoke to someone who made this drive regularly, through the maze of streets that outsiders found confusing onto I-80 heading toward the Bay Bridge. Jake watched the landscape change through the passenger window, urban sprawl, giving way to industrial areas, then suburbs, then finally the rolling hills of wine country. "So," he said, finally breaking the silence as they passed Vallejo. "You going to tell me what I'm walking into, or are we doing this blind?" Madeline's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "My family is complicated. Most families are. Not like this." She took a breath. Eyes still on the road, but her voice settling into the kind of briefing Jake recognized from his uncle's old military stories. Tactical information delivered without emotion. "My father built a real estate empire from nothing. By the time I was born, we had more money than we could spend in 10 lifetimes. My mother came from old Connecticut money, the kind where your last name matters more than anything you actually do. Together they created this expectation machine." Jake listened without interrupting. Let her tell it at her own pace. "I have 2 siblings. My older brother Derek runs the West Coast operations of my father's company. He's married to a woman whose family owns half the commercial properties in San Francisco. They have 3 perfect children, Tyler's 14, Sophie's 11, Jackson's 8, and a perfect life at least on paper. And your other sibling, my younger sister Vanessa." Madeline's voice carried a weight that spoke to complicated history. "She married into New England old money. Charles Huntington IV, if you can believe people still name their children like that. They split their time between Martha's Vineyard and Palm Beach. She specializes in making everyone else feel inadequate by simply existing." "Sounds delightful." "It's a skill." Madeline's laugh was bitter. "And my father will assess you like a business acquisition. My mother will smile while cataloging every flaw. They won't be outright cruel. That would be gauche, but they'll make their opinions known in ways that feel like compliments until you really think about what they said." Jake processed this as they passed through Fairfield, the same stretch of I-80 where he'd helped the elderly couple 3 months ago. "And where do you fit in this picture?" Madeline was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had gone flat. "I'm the one who disappointed everyone by choosing the wrong kind of success." "Wrong kind." "I run my own company, Sterling Solutions, technology, consulting for mid-sized businesses across the Bay Area. We help companies streamline their operations, implement better systems, scale efficiently. It's successful. We did $42 million in revenue last year. We're profitable, growing, making a real difference for our clients." Jake whistled low. 42 million. That was a number so big it didn't feel real. That was, "But I'm not building a dynasty." Madeline's knuckles had gone white on the steering wheel. "I'm not married into power. I'm not producing the next generation of Sterling family legacy. I'm just Maddie who works too hard at something they don't understand and comes to family gatherings alone, which is apparently the worst crime of all." They drove in silence for a while. The landscape outside had transformed completely. Now manicured vineyards, stretching in neat rows, expensive fences, marking property lines, estates visible in the distance that looked more like hotels than homes. This was Napa Valley, where people came to taste wine that cost more per bottle than Jake made in a week. "You said you've done this alone for 5 years, Jake said finally. "What changed?" Madeline's jaw tightened. "Last year, my mother pulled me aside after dinner. She told me she was worried about me, that a woman in her 30s without a partner was either hiding something or broken. She suggested I see a therapist to work through whatever trauma was preventing me from forming normal attachments." Jesus. I told her I didn't need therapy to explain why I hadn't found someone worth my time. She said that was exactly the kind of defensive response that proved her point. Madeline's laugh was sharp enough to cut. "So this year I decided I was done being their cautionary tale. I'm bringing someone real who won't be impressed by the money or the name or the whole performance. Someone who will just exist as himself and remind me that there are people in the world who measure worth differently." Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You know this is just going to create more questions, right?" They're going to want to know where you met me, what I do, why you chose me. You're trading one kind of scrutiny for another. I know. Madeline glanced at him briefly before returning her eyes to the road. But at least this scrutiny is on my terms. I chose you. Not because you fit some checklist, or because our families would merge well, or because you'd look good in Christmas card photos. I chose you because you helped strangers on a highway in 100-degree heat and wouldn't take their money. That means something to me, even if it won't mean anything to them. Jake found himself respecting her more than he'd expected to. This wasn't about revenge or proving a point. It was about survival, about making it through one more weekend in a world that had never quite made space for who she actually was. All right, he said. Then let's get our story straight. Where did we meet? Madeline smiled, and for the first time since they'd started driving, she looked almost relaxed. Actually, we can tell them the truth. That video of you went viral enough that saying I saw it and tracked you down to your Oakland shop isn't unbelievable. We can say I brought my car in for service. We got to talking, and it developed from there. How long have we supposedly been together? 3 months. Long enough to be serious, not so long that they'll question why they haven't heard about you before. What else do I need to know? For the next hour, as vineyards rolled past the windows and the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Madeline briefed him on her family's social dynamics. She told him about her father's obsession with legacy and expansion, how Bill Sterling had grown up in Detroit watching his own father work himself to death in a GM factory, how he'd sworn to never be powerless, how he'd built an empire that now employed hundreds of people across California. She told him about her mother Patricia's suffocating concern, disguised as care, the way Connecticut old money viewed anyone without the right pedigree as fundamentally lesser. She told him about Derek's competitive streak and how he measured everything against his father's approval. About Vanessa's casual cruelty dressed up as sophistication, the way she wielded her aristocratic marriage like a weapon. She told him about family dinners where every conversation was a negotiation, about the way they kept score of achievements and failures with the precision of accountants, about the unspoken rule that vulnerability was weakness and weakness was unforgivable. And as Jake listened, he began to understand why this woman had walked into his shop looking for help. She wasn't running from her family's wealth or status. She was running from their emptiness. One more thing. Madeline's voice pulled him from his thoughts as they turned off the highway onto a smaller road lined with oak trees. My family doesn't know what I do for a living. Not really. They know I run a company, but they think it's small. Cute. A hobby that keeps me busy. But you did $42 million in revenue last year. We employ 67 people. We've transformed operations for over 200 Bay Area companies. But I don't talk about it at family gatherings because the moment I do, my father will want to acquire it. Derek will want to compete with it, and my mother will find some way to turn my success into evidence of my inability to balance work and personal life. Jake let out a low whistle. You're not just successful. You're legitimately successful. Does that change things? Should it? Madeline looked at him. Really looked at him, taking her eyes off the road, longer than was probably safe. For most people, yes. Good thing I'm not most people. They drove in comfortable silence after that until the road began to climb into hills that were manicured rather than wild. The vineyards here were pristine. The fences decorative iron instead of practical wire. The estates visible in the distance looking like they'd been designed by architects who'd never worried about budgets. Finally, Madeline turned through a gate that opened automatically at their approach, some kind of sensor system that Jake didn't bother trying to understand. The driveway was lined with California oaks leading to a house that made Jake bite back a curse. Not a house, an estate, sprawling stone and glass that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread about how the other half lived. The main structure was 3 stories of elegant architecture with wings extending on either side. Terrace gardens were visible in the fading light, perfectly maintained by people who were probably paid more than Jake made in a year. The whole thing overlooked vineyards that stretched to the horizon, Cabernet Sauvignon vines heavy with grapes ready for harvest. "Home, sweet home." Madeline's voice was thick with irony as she pulled up to the circular driveway. Other vehicles were already parked. A Bentley Continental GT that probably cost more than Jake would make in his entire life. A Range Rover that gleamed like it had never seen actual off-road use. A Tesla Model X with custom rims. Through the massive windows, Jake could see people moving around inside elegant figures in expensive clothes, preparing for whatever performance the weekend required. Madeline put the car in park, but didn't move to get out. Her hands were still on the steering wheel, knuckles white breathing, carefully controlled. Last chance to run. Her voice was quiet. Jake looked at the house, then at her. "You running?" "I don't have that option." "Then neither do I." He reached for his door handle, then paused. "Hey, Madeline?" She turned to look at him, and in the fading light, he could see the fear in her eyes. Real fear, the kind that came from walking into a place where you'd been hurt before and knowing you were about to be hurt again. "Whatever happens in there," Jake said, "remember that you asked me here because you wanted someone real. So that's what I'm going to be. Real. Myself. If that embarrasses you or doesn't fit what they expect, that's not my problem. Got it?" For a moment, Madeline just stared at him. Then something in her expression softened. Not relief exactly, but something close to it. "Got it." They got out of the car just as the front door opened. A woman emerged, early 60s, perfectly coiffed hair that had probably required 2 hours at a salon that morning, wearing cream-colored slacks and a silk blouse that cost what Jake made in a month. Her smile was warm and welcoming right up until her eyes landed on Jake. Then the smile became something else entirely, more calculation than greeting. "Madeline, darling." The woman moved down the steps with practiced grace. "You made excellent time." "Traffic was light through Berkeley." Madeline's voice had shifted, becoming more formal, more careful. The armor was back up, Jake realized. The version of her he'd seen in the car was gone, replaced by something harder. "Mother, this is Jake Morrison. Jake, this is my mother, Patricia Sterling." Jake extended his hand, stepping forward with the same confidence he'd use walking into any situation. "Mrs. Sterling, thank you for having me." Patricia took his hand. Her grip was firm but brief. Her skin was soft in a way that spoke to expensive lotions and a life free from manual labor. Her eyes, the same dark brown as Madeline's, assessed him with the precision of someone used to cataloging worth in seconds. "How lovely to meet you, Jake. Madeline has told us absolutely nothing about you, which means we get the pleasure of discovering you fresh." The words were friendly. The tone was not. "I'm an open book." Jake kept his voice easy, unthreatened by her assessment. "Not much mystery to uncover." "Oh, I doubt that." Patricia's smile never quite reached her eyes. "Everyone has mysteries. The question is whether they're interesting ones." Before Jake could respond, a man appeared in the doorway. Tall, silver-haired, with the kind of presence that came from decades of commanding rooms full of people who wanted something from him. He wore slacks and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than Jake's entire wardrobe, and he carried himself like someone who'd never questioned his right to any space he occupied. "Madeline." His voice was deep, measured. "And this must be the mysterious boyfriend we've heard so little about." "Father." Madeline's voice had gone even more controlled. "This is Jake Morrison. Jake, my father, William Sterling." Bill Sterling descended the steps with confidence that bordered on ownership, not just of this property, but of the entire situation. His handshake was firm. A test, Jake realized, seeing how hard Jake would squeeze back whether he'd try to compete or defer. Jake matched it exactly, not competing, not yielding. Equal. Bill's eyebrow rose slightly. Firm grip. That's good. Shows character. Or just that I work with my hands. And what is it you do exactly? Jake met his eyes steadily. I'm a mechanic. I own Morrison's Auto Repair in Oakland. The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia's smile froze in place like someone had pressed pause. Bill's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, surprise maybe, or disappointment, or the kind of calculation Jake had seen in his uncle's eyes when sizing up whether a car was worth fixing. From inside the house, Jake heard someone laugh. The sound cut off abruptly like they'd been shushed. A mechanic. Bill repeated the word slowly, testing it. How practical. Someone has to keep people's cars running. Indeed. Patricia's voice had gone bright in a way that felt dangerous. How wonderfully down-to-earth, Madeline, you've always had such an interesting way of surprising us. Before Madeline could respond, another voice cut through the tension. Well, our baby sister actually brought someone. I didn't think this day would ever come. A man emerged from the house mid-40s, expensively dressed in slacks and a cashmere sweater that matched his father's dark hair going distinguished at the temples. Behind him came a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a society magazine, perfectly assembled in a way that suggested hours of preparation to look effortlessly elegant. And behind them, 3 children, teenager wearing a Stanford t-shirt, looking skeptical younger girl, carrying an iPad studying Jake with open curiosity, and a small boy whose eyes had locked onto Jake's F-150 truck with something close to wonder. Derek? Madeline's voice was carefully neutral. Jake, this is my brother Derek, his wife Amanda and their children, Tyler, Sophie, and Jackson. Derek looked Jake up and down with the kind of assessment that reduced a person to their market value. Amanda's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. The kids hung back watching. A mechanic from Oakland. Derek's voice carried something Jake couldn't quite identify. Not quite mockery, not quite curiosity. How refreshingly blue-collar. Tell me, Jake, where exactly did you two meet? At my shop. Jake kept his answer simple, direct. Madeline brought her car in for service. We got to talking. How romantic. Amanda's voice dripped with something that definitely wasn't sincerity. Car trouble leading to love, like something out of a Hallmark movie. Life's stranger than fiction sometimes. Indeed it is. This voice came from inside female, carrying a faint accent that spoke to East Coast boarding schools and summers in places Jake had never been. A woman descended the grand staircase, visible through the open door. Younger than Derek, older than Madeline, with the kind of beauty that came from expensive maintenance and genetic luck. I'm Vanessa, the sister who made the sensible choice of marrying well rather than working herself to exhaustion. Behind her, a man appeared, a tall, perfectly groomed, wearing a watch that probably cost more than Jake's truck. He looked at everyone with the kind of boredom that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Charles Huntington IV. Jake assumed. New England aristocracy playing at being present. Vanessa, Madeline's voice carried a warning. What, I'm just being honest. Vanessa air-kissed Madeline's cheeks without actually making contact. And you must be the famous Jake. My goodness, Maddie, he's even more rugged than I imagined. Very authentic. The way she said authentic made it sound like an insult. Jake had spent exactly 5 minutes with the Sterling family, and he already understood why Madeline had walked into his shop looking desperate. These people didn't have conversations. They had verbal fencing matches where every word was chosen to draw blood while maintaining plausible deniability. Why don't we get you both settled? Patricia suggested, gesturing toward the house with the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance. Dinner's at 7, business casual as always. I'm sure Madeline can help you navigate our dress code, Jake. I'm sure she can. Jake picked up both his duffel bag and Madeline's weekend bag from the car. The weight was nothing compared to the transmission he'd carried into his shop earlier in the week, but he saw Patricia's eyes track the gesture old-fashioned manners that didn't quite fit with her assessment of him. As they walked into the house, Derek fell into step beside Jake. So, a mechanic. That's honest work. It pays the bills. I'm sure it does, though I imagine the bills are quite different in your world than in ours. Derek's smile was friendly. His eyes were not. How long have you and Madeline been seeing each other? About 3 months. Funny. Derek's voice stayed light, conversational. She hasn't mentioned you once in our weekly calls. Jake kept walking, refusing to take the bait. Maybe she wanted to keep something private for once. Or maybe she wanted to make sure you were worth mentioning before she subjected you to the Sterling family experience. Derek's smile sharpened. We can be a bit intense. I've noticed. Have you? Derek laughed. Well, you haven't seen anything yet. Wait until dinner. That's when things get really interesting. They reached the grand staircase marble and wrought iron that probably came from some European castle, and Madeline touched Jake's arm. We're in the East Wing. I'll show you to your room. Rooms? Patricia corrected gently, following them up the stairs. We've put Jake in the blue room right next to yours, dear. I know you're modern young people, but this is still my home, and we do maintain certain standards. Madeline's cheeks flushed, but she nodded. Of course, Mother. The blue room is lovely. As they climbed the stairs, Jake could feel multiple sets of eyes on his back, assessing, judging, cataloging every detail for later discussion. He'd walked into situations before that felt hostile, angry customers, the occasional drunk looking for a fight, but this was different. This was refined hostility, polished, dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with physical threat and everything to do with the kind of social warfare he'd never learned to fight. Madeline led him down a hallway lined with expensive art and family photos that looked more staged than lived. She stopped at a door, pushing it open to reveal a bedroom that was bigger than Jake's entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the vineyard. A king-sized bed dominated one wall. The attached bathroom was visible through an open door, all marble and fixtures that probably came with price tags Jake didn't want to imagine. This is the blue room. Madeline's voice was flat, exhausted. Jake set his bag down on a chair that looked like it belonged in a museum. Then he turned to face her, really looking at her for the first time since they'd arrived. The armor was cracking. He could see it in the way her shoulders had started to curve inward, the way her hands trembled slightly before she shoved them in her pockets. Your family's intense is like saying the ocean's damp. Madeline closed the door behind them and leaned against it, and suddenly all the exhaustion was visible. The performance dropped completely. I'm sorry. I knew they'd be difficult, but don't apologize. Jake cut her off. You warned me. I went in with eyes open. He studied her face, seeing past the makeup and the careful presentation to the person underneath. You okay? I've had warmer welcomes at dental appointments. Jake surprised himself by laughing. Yeah, I got that impression. Your brother's a piece of work. Derek sees everyone as either competition or a resource. You're currently being evaluated for which category you fall into. And your sister, Vanessa, measures her worth by how thoroughly she can make others feel inadequate. It's her only real skill. Madeline pushed away from the door, moving to the window. California sunset was painting the vineyard in shades of gold and amber. I should let you get settled. Dinner's in an hour. She started toward the door, but Jake's voice stopped her. Hey, she turned back. We survived the first 5 minutes. That's something. Madeline's smile was small but genuine. Yeah, I guess it is. After she left, Jake stood alone in the blue room, looking out at vineyards that probably produced wine he'd never taste and couldn't afford if he wanted to. He thought about his apartment above Mrs. Chen's restaurant, about the simple life he'd built brick by careful brick after losing everything that mattered, about Emily's photograph on his desk and the way guilt felt like betrayal every time he thought about caring for someone new. This weekend was going to test every wall he'd built around his heart. But as he opened his duffel bag and found the clothes Madeline had sent, perfectly fitted blazer in charcoal gray matching slacks, crisp white shirt that had clearly been tailored to his measurements, Jake found himself thinking about Madeline's eyes when she'd said she was always alone with her family. He thought about the way she'd held herself together in front of their judgment, the armor she wore that was so much heavier than any blazer. And he thought about the fact that he'd agreed to this plan not for money, not for excitement, but because he'd recognized something in her that he knew too well. The loneliness of being surrounded by people who looked at you but never actually saw you. Jake checked his reflection in the mirror, the mechanic from Oakland wearing clothes worth more than his monthly rent, about to have dinner with people who measured worth in dollars and legacy. Well, he said to his reflection, this should be interesting. Then he opened the door and went to face whatever the Sterling family had planned for dinner, knowing that the real test wasn't about surviving their questions or their judgment. It was about helping one woman feel less alone for one weekend. And that, Jake thought as he walked down the hallway toward the sound of cultured voices and clinking crystal, was something he could do, even if it cost him more than he was ready to admit. The basketball bounced across asphalt with the irregular rhythm of a cheap ball losing air. Jake found the source of the sound by following laughter, young voices, competitive but not mean. Around the side of the estate, past ornamental gardens that probably required a full-time staff, a regulation court had been built into the hillside. Professionally surfaced LED lighting already coming on as dusk settled over Napa Valley. 3 kids. The teenager in the Stanford shirt Tyler was dribbling with decent form, showing off for his younger siblings. Sophie sat cross-legged on the sideline with her iPad, but her eyes tracked the game instead of the screen. Jackson, the 8-year-old, was trying to guard his brother despite being half his height. Jake had changed into jeans and a button-down the blazer left upstairs because dinner was still 40 minutes away, and he'd rather meet the kids before facing the adults again. The ball rolled toward him as he approached, and he caught it without thinking. Tyler stopped mid-dribble, surprised. "Lucky catch!" Jake spun the ball in his hands, once feeling the weight, then stepped to the three-point line and shot. The ball arced perfectly, swishing through without touching the rim. Tyler's expression shifted from skeptical to grudgingly impressed. "Okay, lucky shot. Try me." Jake passed the ball back. They played one-on-one while the California sky darkened from gold to purple. Tyler had skills someone had paid for, coaching probably expensive camps in the Bay Area, but Jake had grown up playing pickup games in Sacramento where being tall wasn't enough if you couldn't handle actual defense. He didn't embarrass the kid, but he didn't let him win either. "You're the mechanic." Tyler drove toward the basket, Jake staying with him. "That's different. You sound like your parents." Jake blocked the shot without fouling. "Got your own opinions or just repeating theirs?" The ball bounced away and Jackson retrieved it, holding it like a prize. Tyler's face flushed, but something in his eyes shifted. Nobody had called him on that kind of thing before, Jake realized. Nobody had treated him like someone capable of independent thought. Sophie approached with her iPad, but she wasn't looking at the screen. "Can you really fix anything?" "Most things." Jake caught the ball. Jackson tossed back. "Why?" She disappeared into the house and returned 2 minutes later carrying a remote control car. American brand, Traxxas, expensive but currently dead in her hands. "It stopped working last month. Dad said he'd look at it, but he's always busy." Jake knelt on the asphalt, setting the car down. He pulled his Leatherman from his pocket, the same multi-tool his uncle had carried for 40 years, passed down when he died. Opened the battery compartment, found the connection corroded. 2 minutes with the knife blade scraping contacts clean and the car whirred to life in Sophie's hands, her face transformed. Pure joy, the kind kids showed before they learned to hide their emotions. Jackson had dropped to his knees beside Jake, watching every movement with the intensity of someone discovering magic existed. Nobody else would take time to fix this. All the grown-ups just say later and forget. Jake handed the car back to Sophie. Things are worth fixing, especially when they matter to someone. Thanks, Jake. You're nice. For a mechanic, Tyler added, but the edge was gone from his voice. He shot the basketball, missed, grabbed the rebound. Wanna keep playing? They played until Patricia's voice cut through the evening air, calling everyone to get ready for dinner. The kids scattered toward the house, Sophie clutching her resurrected car. But Tyler paused at the door. Jake, that was actually cool, the car thing. Your sister was happy. That's what matters. Tyler nodded like Jake had said something profound instead of obvious. Then he was gone and Jake was left alone on the basketball court as the last light faded from the sky. The dining room could have comfortably seated 30. Tonight it held 12 around a table that gleamed with crystal and silver, lit by chandeliers that cast everything in warm light that felt anything but warm. Jake sat to Madeline's left, directly across from Vanessa and Charles. Derek and Amanda flanked Bill at the head of the table. Patricia presided from the opposite end like a queen surveying her court. And the kids were there, not banished to eat elsewhere like Jake had expected. Jackson had claimed the seat next to Jake deliberately. Sophie sat across from him, and Tyler was at the far end but close enough to watch everything. Staff appeared from hidden doors to serve the first-course soup that probably had a French name Jake wouldn't pronounce correctly. He picked up the correct spoon without hesitation, the diagram Madeline had texted him during the week proving useful. Bill opened the assault while cutting his bread with a silver knife. So Jake, Madeline tells us you own your own business. That's admirable. The American dream, building something from nothing. I don't know about the American dream. Jake kept his voice even conversational. But it's mine and it pays the bills. How modest. Vanessa's voice carried across the table like a blade wrapped in silk. Tell me, how does a mechanic from Oakland date someone like our Madeline? It seems quite the social leap. Jackson stopped eating his spoon, frozen halfway to his mouth. Sophie's eyes went wide. Tyler leaned forward slightly, and Jake realized the kids were suddenly paying attention in a way they probably didn't during normal family dinners. I don't really think in those terms. Jake met Vanessa's eyes calmly. People are people, regardless of bank accounts. How very egalitarian. Charles spoke for the first time all evening, his voice carrying the bored drawl of someone who'd never had to work for anything. One wonders if that philosophy holds up when the bills come due. It holds up fine when you live within your means. Amanda set down her fork with deliberate precision. What kinds of things do you and Madeline have in common? I'm trying to imagine what a mechanic and a tech CEO would bond over. Jake took a sip of wine, Napa Valley Cabernet, that probably cost more per bottle than he made in a day, and considered his answer. We both know what it's like to build something from scratch. We both understand that reputation matters more than advertising. And we both appreciate honesty over performance. The last word hung in the air like a challenge. Patricia's smile didn't waver, but something sharp appeared behind her eyes. Honesty is certainly important, though I've always believed that courtesy and honesty can coexist beautifully when one has sufficient practice. I'm sure they can. Jake's voice stayed level. I just prefer to spend my time fixing engines instead of perfecting diplomatic language. Derek laughed, sharp, sudden sound. I like him, Madeline. He's refreshingly direct, not at all what I expected. And what did you expect? Madeline's voice had gone quiet in a way that made Jake think of compressed springs. Someone more polished. Someone who understood the way our world works. Derek swirled his wine, watching the liquid catch the chandelier light. But maybe that's exactly why you chose him, because he doesn't understand it, and therefore can't be corrupted by it. Or maybe I chose him because he treats me like a human being instead of a business opportunity. Sophie looked at her mother, then at Madeline, something clicking in her 11-year-old brain. Mom, why are you being mean to Jake? He's nice. He fixed my car. Amanda's expression went tight. We're not being mean, honey. We're just asking questions. You're asking mean questions. Jackson's voice was a matter of fact, the kind of truth that only 8-year-olds could deliver without apology. Derek's face flushed. Jackson, that's enough. But the damage was done. The kids had spoken the truth everyone else was dancing around, and suddenly the whole table felt it. The adults performing, the children seeing through it. The gap between what was being said and what was actually happening. Bill cleared his throat, trying to reclaim control. Perhaps we should discuss something more pleasant. Jake, tell us about your family. Where did you grow up? Here it comes, Jake thought. The excavation of his background to find something that explained why he wasn't suitable. Sacramento. My parents died in a car accident on Highway 50 when I was 10. My uncle raised me. He was a mechanic, ran a shop there for 40 years before a heart attack took him 8 years ago. Jake delivered the information without emotion, facts stated cleanly. No siblings. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, wine glass held like a prop in a play she'd rehearsed. So you're quite alone. No family at all. I've learned to build family from people who choose to be in my life rather than people who share my DNA. How very modern. Charles murmured the word modern, carrying the same weight as unfortunate. Derek leaned forward, laser-focused now. 3 months, you said, and Madeline hasn't mentioned you once in our weekly calls. That's interesting. Tyler's eyes tracked between his father and his aunt. Sophie had gone very still. Jackson kept eating, but Jake could tell he was listening to every word. Maybe she wanted to keep something private for once, Jake said. Novel concept, I know. Or maybe she wanted to make sure you were worth mentioning before subjecting you to the Sterling family experience. Derek's smile was all teeth. We can be intense. I've noticed. The conversation turned Bill asking about Jake's growth strategy, Patricia inquiring about his business model, Amanda probing about how he planned to expand. Questions designed to expose the limitations of his ambitions to highlight the gap between his small Oakland shop and their empire built across California. Jake answered honestly. He had 3 employees. He had no expansion plans. He made enough to keep everyone paid and the lights on. Sufficient. Bill's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Not thriving, not growing, not building towards something larger. Sufficient is underrated. Jake set down his fork, meeting Bill's eyes directly. Not everyone needs to conquer the world, but everyone who's worth their salt wants to leave a mark. Bill's voice had gone hard. Legacy matters, Jake. What we build, what we pass on, that's what defines us. I think what defines us is how we treat people when we have nothing to gain from treating them well. Jake felt Madeline's hand find his knee under the table, warning or support, he couldn't tell which. Legacy is just another word for ego if it comes at the expense of human decency. The soup course was cleared in silence so thick it pressed against Jake's chest. The second course arrived, fish with sauce that probably had a name, and people ate mechanically aware of every eye on the table, every assessment being made. Then Amanda went for blood. Jake, let's be realistic for a moment. She set down her fork, giving him her full attention in a way that felt predatory. Madeline is successful, educated from a prominent family. She moves in circles where business and personal life naturally intertwine. Are you truly telling us that your little Oakland shop wouldn't benefit from her connections? That you haven't thought about how access to her network could change your business? Jake looked at her calmly. My little shop is exactly the size I want it to be. I don't need growth. I don't need connections. What I need is to do good work for fair pay and go home at night knowing I helped someone solve a problem. Madeline's connections don't factor into that equation. Then you're either a liar or a fool, Vanessa said bluntly. Everyone wants something. Everyone has an angle. You're just better at hiding yours. Madeline's hand on his knee tightened until her nails dug in through his slacks. Jake could feel her entire body vibrating with tension, could sense she was about 3 seconds from shattering. Or... Madeline's voice cut through the dining room like broken glass. She stood suddenly, her chair scraping against expensive hardwood. He's telling the truth, and you can't comprehend that because you've never met anyone who values integrity over advancement. Victoria's eyes widened. Derek's fork froze mid-air. Even Charles looked mildly interested for the first time all evening. "Excuse me," Vanessa's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "You heard me." Madeline was pacing now, her polished veneer cracking to reveal fury that had been building for years. "Lucas came here because I asked him to, not because he thought he'd gain something from our family, not because he's looking for business opportunities, not because he's trying to climb some social ladder you all seem to think everyone's desperate to ascend. He came because I needed help, and he's the kind of person who helps people when they ask." "Madeline, darling," Patricia began. "No, Mother." Madeline spun to face her. "You wanted honesty. Let's have honesty. I've spent this entire meal watching you pick apart a good man because he doesn't fit your narrow definition of acceptable. Because he works with his hands. Because he's from Oakland instead of Connecticut. Because he measures success differently than you do." She turned to Bill. "When's the last time you asked about my company? Dad actually asked, not suggested I sell it or go public or let you acquire it. When's the last time you celebrated my success without immediately comparing it to Derek's?" Bill opened his mouth, but nothing came out. "I'll tell you when." Madeline's voice was shaking now, but she kept going. "Never. Not once in the 6 years since I founded Sterling Solutions. Because in this family, achievement only counts if it builds the dynasty. If it adds to the Sterling legacy. Everything else is just a hobby keeping me busy until I wise up and do what you actually want." Tyler sat frozen, staring at his aunt like he'd never seen her before. Sophie's eyes were huge. Jackson had stopped eating entirely. "That's not fair," Derek protested. "I've never asked for—" "You don't have to ask." Madeline's laugh was bitter. "You're the golden child. You took over the family business. You married Amanda from the right San Francisco family. You produced Tyler, Sophie, and Jackson to carry on the Sterling name. You did everything right according to the rule book I never agreed to follow." She turned back to the whole table, her voice dropping but somehow carrying more weight. "You want to know what Sterling Solutions did last year? $42 million in revenue. 67 employees across the Bay Area. Over 200 companies whose operations we've transformed. I built that. Me, without family money, without the Sterling real estate empire, without any of your help." Bill's face had gone pale. $42 million. Why didn't you? Because the moment I tell you the real numbers, you'll want to acquire it, or Derek will see it as competition, or Mom will find some way to turn my professional success into evidence I can't balance work and personal life. Madeline's eyes were wet now, but her voice stayed strong. "I can't win with you people. If I'm alone, I'm broken and need therapy. If I bring someone like Jake, he's not good enough because he doesn't fit your checklist. There's literally no version of my life that would make you happy because you don't actually care about my happiness. You care about whether I'm living up to the Sterling legacy." Tyler stood up suddenly. "Aunt Maddie's right." His voice cracked on the words, but he pushed through. "I hear you guys talking about her after she leaves, about how she needs to settle down and have kids and stop working so hard. Like she's some kind of problem that needs solving instead of, he gestured helplessly, instead of just being successful on her own terms. Tyler, sit down, Derek said. No. Tyler's hands were shaking, but he didn't sit. Aunt Maddie is kind of a badass. She built a company that does $42 million a year, and none of you even knew because you never bothered to actually ask about her life. And Jake fixed Sophie's toy car in 2 minutes without even thinking about it because he saw it mattered to her. That's more than any of you have done. Sophie nodded vigorously. Jackson looked at his brother with something like awe. The dining room had gone completely silent except for the sound of Madeline's unsteady breathing and the quiet hum of the chandelier overhead. Then Bill pushed back from the table, standing with the kind of authority that demanded attention. I think we need a break. Everyone's emotions are running high and we're saying things that perhaps should be said more carefully. It was a retreat disguised as wisdom, and everyone at the table recognized it for what it was. Staff appeared as if summoned by telepathy, clearing plates that were still half full. The family scattered like shrapnel, Derek and Amanda to the terrace, Vanessa and Charles to the library, Patricia toward the kitchen. Bill stood at the head of the table looking at Madeline and Jake still seated. Jake, a word in my study if you don't mind. It wasn't a request. Madeline's hand tightened on Jake's. Father, it's fine, Jake said quietly. He stood, squeezed her hand once, then followed Bill through the house. The workshop was separate from the main house, a building Jake hadn't noticed in the dark when they'd arrived. Bill led him there in silence, unlocking a door that opened onto a space that smelled like motor oil and old leather and metal. Vintage American cars filled the garage, a 1967 Ford Mustang on a lift, a Corvette Stingray from the 60s, a Chevelle SS with its hood up, Snap-on tools everywhere, organized with the precision of someone who actually used them, Pennzoil cans stacked against one wall, racing posters from American tracks Laguna Seca, Indianapolis, Daytona. Bill poured bourbon from a bottle that probably cost more than Jake made in a week. Handed Jake a glass without asking if he wanted it. Then he picked up a wrench and moved to the Mustang, settling into work like it was meditation. Some things you want to do with your own hands. Jake set his glass down and joined him under the hood. They worked in silence for several minutes, Bill pointing out what needed attention, Jake handing him tools, both of them falling into the rhythm that any two mechanics understood, regardless of their tax brackets. My father worked in a GM plant in Detroit. Bill's voice was quiet, focused on the carburetor he was adjusting. 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. Died at 52 from a heart attack right there on the factory floor. Never owned anything. Never traveled anywhere. Never had a single day where he wasn't worried about money. Jake tightened a connection Bill indicated, saying nothing. I was 14 when he died. I swore I'd never live like that, never be powerless, never be dependent on someone else's mercy for my survival. Bill's hands moved with the confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. So I worked. I studied. I built. By the time I was 30, I'd made my first million. By 40, I'd built an empire. Was it worth it? Jake asked quietly. Bill paused, wrench held in midair. That's the question, isn't it? He set the tool down, wiped his hands on a rag. I gave my children everything my father couldn't give me. Security, opportunity, education. But somewhere along the way, I also gave them the burden of expectations, the weight of legacy, the pressure to be worthy of everything I'd built. Jake thought about his uncle's shop in Sacramento, the way it had barely made enough to keep food on the table, the way his uncle had worked until his body gave out, and even then he'd died with grease under his fingernails because he'd been fixing someone's car when the heart attack hit. Some debts can't be paid with money, only with time and attention and giving a damn. Madeline doesn't need to be worthy, Jake said. She already is. She just needs you to see it. Bill looked at him for a long moment, really looked at him in a way he hadn't during dinner. You're going to break her heart, not because you mean to, but because eventually the reality of who you are and who she is will create a gap too wide to bridge. And when that happens, my daughter will be the one who pays the price. Or we'll build that bridge together. Jake met his eyes. One honest conversation at a time. One choice at a time. One moment of choosing each other over the easy path. That's optimism talking. Optimism breaks eventually. Reality has a way of wearing it down. I've had my optimism broken before, Mr. Sterling. I know what that costs. Jake thought about Emily, about the funeral in the rain, about 6 years of not letting anyone matter. But I also know that cynicism is just another kind of cowardice. It's easier to assume failure than to risk hoping for something better. Bill pulled a business card from his wallet, wrote something on the back with a pen from his pocket. My direct cell. If you ever need advice about loving stubborn women, call me. Not the office, not my assistant. Me. He handed the card over and Jake tucked it into his pocket. When Patricia and I got married, I had nothing. Her family, old Connecticut money going back to the Mayflower, thought I was trash from Detroit. They gave us 5 years before she'd come running back to Greenwich. Bill's voice had gone rough with emotion he was trying to hide. We've been married 42 years. You know what made the difference? What? She chose to believe in what we were building, instead of what everyone said we couldn't have. If you're going to be with my daughter, you'll need to make that same choice every day. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. They finished the work on the Mustang in silence. When Jake finally headed back to the house, his hands smelled like motor oil and Kentucky bourbon, and he was carrying the weight of a father's warning wrapped up as a blessing. He found Madeline in the garden, standing alone under lights that turned the cultivated landscape into something almost magical. She turned as he approached, and Jake saw tracks of tears on her face that she hadn't bothered to hide. Did he threaten you? A little? Did you deserve it? Probably. Madeline's lips quirked, despite everything. Good. You were pretty brutal at dinner. So were you. I know. She looked at her father through the workshop window visible working on his cars. I don't know what just happened. I've never said those things out loud before. Jake moved closer, close enough that he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. Maybe it was time. They stood there as night deepened over Napa Valley, two people who'd just blown up a family dinner and had no idea what came next. Madeline's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, then showed Jake the screen. Derek. We need to talk. Library. Now. Jake, want me to come? Madeline, no. This is something I need to do alone. She walked back toward the house with her shoulders squared like someone preparing for battle. Jake watched her go, then stayed in the garden for another 20 minutes, giving her space for whatever conversation was about to happen. When he finally went inside, he found Tyler sitting on the grand staircase, still in his dinner clothes, staring at nothing. You okay, kid? Tyler looked up, and Jake saw something in his 14-year-old eyes that looked way too old. Is it always like this? With families? Jake sat down beside him on the marble stairs. Some families, yeah. The ones who forget that being related doesn't automatically mean you understand each other. I've never heard Aunt Mattie talk like that. She's always so... Tyler gestured helplessly. So controlled. Sometimes control is just another word for surviving. Your aunt's been surviving for a long time. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Tyler said, My parents were talking after everyone left. They think you're going to break her heart. What do you think? Tyler looked at him with surprise, that same surprise from the basketball court, like adults asking his opinion was a foreign concept. I think you actually like her, not her money. You fixed Sophie's car without thinking about it. That's not something someone who's faking would do. From somewhere deeper in the house raised voices, not shouting, but intense. Jake couldn't make out words, but he recognized Madeline's voice and Derek's going back and forth like a tennis match. Sophie appeared at the top of the stairs in pajamas, rubbing her eyes. Are they fighting again? Talking, Tyler corrected, loudly. Same thing. Sophie came down and sat on Jake's other side, small and worried. If you love Aunt Maddie, why don't you just get married? Jake felt the question hit him square in the chest. 8 years old and cutting straight to the truth. It's more complicated than that, kiddo. Adults always say that. Jackson's voice came from behind them. The whole family was gathering on the stairs, now drawn by the sound of honest emotion in a house that usually ran on performance. But it's not. My friend Tommy's parents got divorced because his dad said things were complicated. Then his dad married someone else 6 months later. It wasn't complicated. He just didn't love Tommy's mom anymore. Jake looked at these 3 kids, Tyler trying to figure out what kind of man he wanted to be. Sophie watching everything with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Jackson speaking truth with the fearlessness that comes before the world teaches you to lie. Do you love Aunt Maddie? Sophie asked. The question hung in the air. From deeper in the house, the voices had gone quiet. Jake wondered if the conversation was over or if they'd just moved somewhere more private. Yeah, he said finally. I do. Then marry her, Tyler said, like it was the simplest thing in the world. That's what people who love each other do. Before Jake could respond, Madeline appeared at the end of the hallway. Her eyes were red, but her face was set with something like determination. She looked at Jake, surrounded by her nieces and nephew, all of them waiting for the next move in this family drama. Kids, it's late. Go to bed. They scattered reluctantly, Sophie hugging Jake before she went. Tyler nodded at him like they'd reached some understanding. Jackson waved. Then it was just Jake and Madeline in the hallway, and whatever had happened in that library was written all over her face. Derek apologized, she said, and her voice was hollow with shock. Actually apologized for comparing himself to me all these years, for making everything a competition I never signed up for. Jake stood walking toward her. That's good, right? I don't know. Madeline's laugh was unsteady. I've spent so long being angry at them that I don't know what to do now that they're actually listening. She looked up at him, and Jake saw fear there. Real fear. Not of her family anymore, but of something else. Something that had to do with the way Jackson's question was still echoing in his head. Do you love Aunt Maddie? Yeah, I do. And suddenly, Jake realized the danger he was in. This weekend was supposed to be temporary, a favor for someone who needed help, a chance to do something good and then return to his safe, simple life. But somewhere between fixing Sophie's toy car and defending Madeline at dinner and working on vintage Fords with a father who was learning to express pride without conditions, somewhere in there Jake had stopped performing and started meaning it. He cared about her, more than he'd cared about anyone in 6 years. More than felt safe. Madeline saw something in his face because her expression shifted, softened. Jake, we should get some sleep, he said, cutting her off before she could finish whatever she'd been about to say. It's been a long day. They walked upstairs together in silence, and when they reached their doors, the blue room and her room right next to each other, Madeline touched his arm. Thank you. For tonight. For saying the things I couldn't say myself. You said plenty. Only after you went first. She smiled, tired but genuine. Only after you made it clear that someone in that room was actually on my side. Jake looked at her. Really looked at her, this woman who ran a $42 million company but couldn't get her family to see her value, who'd walked into his Oakland shop desperate and alone, who'd just fought for herself in front of people who should have been fighting for her all along. "Good night, Maddie." "Good night, Jake." He watched her disappear into her room before heading into the blue room. The space felt different now, less like a hotel, more like the eye of a storm that was still building, because tomorrow there would be consequences for tonight's explosion. Tomorrow Patricia would make her move. Bill would test whether his blessing was warranted, and Jake would have to figure out if he was ready for whatever came next. And somewhere in all of that, he'd have to face the truth that Jackson's 8-year-old wisdom had exposed. He loved Madeline Sterling, and love, Jake knew from bitter experience, was the most dangerous risk of all. Morning came too early. Jake woke to sunlight streaming through windows. He'd forgotten to cover his body, still on Oakland time up at 6, whether he wanted to be or not. The blue room felt less foreign now, but he still didn't belong here. That much was clear. He showered, dressed in jeans and the button-down from yesterday, and headed downstairs following the smell of coffee. The kitchen was enormous, all marble counters and professional-grade appliances that probably cost more than his entire shop, and surprisingly empty except for one person. Vanessa sat at the breakfast bar in silk pajamas and a robe that probably cost what Jake made in a month. She looked up as he entered, and her expression wasn't the polished cruelty from dinner. It was something raw, tired maybe, or honest for the first time. "Coffee's fresh." She gestured to a machine that looked like it required an engineering degree. "Fair warning, it's stronger than you're probably used to." Jake poured himself a cup, added cream and sugar, took an experimental sip. It was excellent. Of course it was excellent. Everything in this house was excellent except the emotional temperature. "How'd you sleep?" Like someone who just survived a hostile interrogation. Vanessa laughed, real laugh, not the performative version from dinner. "Yeah, we weren't exactly subtle, were we?" Jake settled onto a stool across from her. "Is there a reason you're talking to me like a human being this morning, instead of dissecting my net worth?" "I've been thinking about what you said last night. About us loving the version of Maddie that fits our expectations more than the version that exists." She took a long sip of her coffee. "That bothered me." "Good. It should. Don't push it." But her tone lacked real heat. "I called my sister a lot of things over the years. Stubborn, difficult, too independent for her own good. But I never once considered that maybe those weren't flaws. That maybe she was just refusing to be someone she's not." Jake waited, sensing there was more coming. "I married Charles because he was exactly what my family wanted. Old money, New England connections, impeccable lineage from families that came over on the actual Mayflower. It was the smart choice, the strategic choice." Vanessa stared into her coffee like it held answers. "And I've spent 6 years in a marriage that looks perfect from the outside and feels empty on the inside." "I'm sorry. Don't be. I made my choice with full awareness of what I was trading. Security for passion. Approval for authenticity. I thought I was being mature, choosing practical over emotional." She looked up at him. "But watching you defend Maddie last night, watching her defend you, I realized I've never had someone look at me the way she looks at you." Jake shifted uncomfortably. This conversation felt too intimate, too close to truths he wasn't ready to examine in daylight. "I'm not hitting on you," Vanessa said quickly. "God, no. You're not my type at all. Too earnest, too direct. I prefer men who understand subtext." She paused. "But you're exactly Maddie's type. Someone who doesn't play games. Someone who says what they mean and means what they say. Someone who chose her without calculating what he'd get in return." "How do you know I didn't calculate?" "Because you were genuinely shocked when Amanda mentioned Maddie's revenue numbers at dinner. Either you're the best actor I've ever met, or you really didn't know how successful she is." And given everything else about you, I'm betting on the latter. Vanessa leaned forward and Jake saw something in her eyes that looked like desperation. My marriage is over. I'm going to file for divorce when we get back to Martha's Vineyard. But before I do, I need to know something. Is it actually possible to have both success and authenticity, career and real connection? Jake thought about Emily, about the plans they'd made before the accident took her, about 6 years of telling himself that work was enough, that safety was better than risk. I don't know, he said honestly. I think so. But I think it requires both people being willing to keep choosing each other, even when it's hard, even when the practical concerns start stacking up. Maddie has acquisition offers on the table. Did you know that? Jake went still. No. Seattle firm. Tech Vision Solutions. $120 million valuation. They want her to relocate at least part-time. Possibly permanent, depending on how integration goes. Vanessa watched his face carefully. When she's traveling for international deals, making decisions that affect hundreds of jobs, will you be able to handle not fully understanding that pressure? The question hit Jake square in the chest. He thought about his shop, 3 employees, 1 location, the kind of problems he could solve with his hands. He thought about Maddie running a company worth 9 figures, making decisions that rippled through the Bay Area economy. I don't know, he admitted, but I think understanding every detail matters less than respecting that her world is important to her. Supporting her when it's hard. Celebrating with her when she succeeds. Being there even when I don't fully grasp the stakes. Vanessa studied him for a long moment. Then she smiled, sad, wistful. Maddie's lucky to have you. The kitchen filled with more people then. Patricia appeared with her morning routine already perfected. Derek and Amanda shepherded the kids in for breakfast. Tyler gave Jake a small nod. Sophie showed him her remote control car still working. Jackson climbed onto the stool next to him like they were old friends. Bill was the last to arrive, and when his eyes met Jake's across the kitchen, something passed between them. Not quite approval, but acknowledgement. The beginning of respect. Breakfast became organized chaos, staff bringing food, kids chattering about what they wanted to do today, adults making plans to avoid yesterday's minefield. Patricia touched Maddie's arm as coffee was poured. Darling, could we talk? Just the 2 of us. Maddie tensed but nodded. They disappeared toward the garden, and Jake watched them go with the same worry he'd felt last night. Whatever happened in these conversations mattered. The Sterling family was shifting, changing, and he didn't know if that made things better or worse. When Maddie returned 20 minutes later, her eyes were red, but her face looked lighter somehow, like she'd set down weight she'd been carrying for years. My mother apologized, she said quietly to Jake as they stood in the hallway. Actually apologized for testing you, for assuming the worst, for years of making me feel like I was broken instead of just different. That's good, right? I think so, I'm not sure. I've built so much of my identity around being the disappointment that I don't know who I am if they actually accept me. Before Jake could respond, Bill appeared in the doorway to his study. Maddie, could I borrow you for a moment? She looked at Jake, seeking permission or reassurance, he couldn't tell which. He nodded, and she followed her father into the wood-paneled room. Jake was left alone with his coffee and the growing certainty that this weekend had fundamentally changed something. Not just for Maddie and her family, but for him. He'd walked in here planning to help someone survive 3 days and then return to his safe, simple life. But Jackson's question kept echoing in his head. Do you love Aunt Maddie? Yeah, I do. And that changed everything. The rest of the weekend passed in a strange limbo. The Sterlings were trying awkwardly, imperfectly, but genuinely trying to be a family instead of a performance troupe. Derek asked Maddie about her company with actual curiosity. Patricia complimented her daughter without immediately adding a criticism. Bill showed Maddie his workshop and talked about his own father with a vulnerability Jake hadn't seen at dinner. Tyler asked Jake if he could come work at the Oakland shop next summer. Sophie showed everyone her fixed car at least 15 times. Jackson declared that Jake was his new favorite person and followed him around like a puppy. Sunday afternoon arrived with the bittersweet quality of endings. The family gathered in the driveway for goodbyes that felt different than Jake expected. Real hugs instead of air kisses. Genuine promises to stay in touch. Tyler shook Jake's hand firmly. Sophie made him promise to teach her how to fix things. Jackson announced that when Jake and Maddie got married, he wanted to be the ring bearer. Bill pulled Jake aside one last time. My daughter's going to make a decision about those acquisition offers soon. Maybe not this week, but within the year. When she does, her life will change dramatically. She'll need someone who can handle that. I understand. Do you? Bill's eyes were sharp. Because loving someone means supporting their growth even when it complicates your life beyond recognition. Jake thought about that as he and Maddie drove away from the estate Napa Valley Vineyards, giving way to hills, giving way to the freeway, back to Oakland. They were quiet for the first hour, both processing everything that had happened. Finally, as they crossed the Bay Bridge with the San Francisco skyline visible in the distance, Maddie spoke. I need to tell you about the acquisition. Jake's chest tightened, but he kept his voice steady. Okay. Leading offer from a Seattle firm. Tech Vision Solutions. $120 million valuation. They want to acquire Sterling Solutions, keep me on as CEO for 3 years, but... She paused. Relocation required. At least part-time. Possibly permanent. The number was so big it felt abstract. $120 million. That was Jake couldn't even process what that meant. Okay, he said again. Okay. Maddie glanced at him surprised. That's all you have to say. What do you want me to say? That I'll ask you not to take it. That I'll guilt you into choosing our relationship over your career. Jake kept his eyes on the road ahead. I won't do that, Maddie. I can't be the reason you don't reach for something you worked your entire life to achieve. But what does that mean for us? It means we have a decision to make, both of us. You need to decide if the acquisition is worth the changes it'll require. And I need to decide if I'm willing to build a relationship that might involve distance and complexity I didn't anticipate. He looked at her briefly before returning his eyes to traffic. But Maddie, we're not there yet. We don't even know if you're taking the offer. Let's not borrow problems from a future that hasn't happened yet. They pulled up to his apartment in Oakland, the contrast stark. From Napa Valley estates to working-class neighborhood in 2 hours. Maddie put the car in park, but neither of them moved to get out. I'm terrified, she said quietly. Of what? Of making the wrong choice. Of wanting this us so badly that I compromise everything I've built. Of not wanting it enough and losing you because I chose work. Her hands gripped the steering wheel. I've spent my entire adult life being independent, not needing anyone. And now I've found someone who makes me want something different. But I have no idea how to do that without sacrificing who I am. Jake took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. Then we figure it out, together. One honest conversation at a time. But as he climbed the stairs to his apartment and watched her drive away toward San Francisco, Jake felt the weight of what was coming. This weekend had been contained, controlled. Real life was messier, more complicated, full of practical concerns that love didn't automatically solve. 3 weeks crawled by like months. Jake and Maddie talked every night, sometimes for hours, sometimes just brief check-ins before emergencies pulled one of them away. They saw each other when they could steal time. Maddie showing up at the Oakland shop at 7 in the morning with Pete's coffee. Jake driving to her San Francisco office at 11 at night when she texted that she was overwhelmed. They had their first real fight in week 2. Jake had scheduled a fishing trip to Lake Tahoe planned for months with Tony and Marcus. The same weekend, Maddie had a client crisis that required all hands on deck. She called Friday morning voice frantic, asking if he could cancel. I can't just bail on them, Jake said, already feeling guilt creep in. So you're choosing a fishing trip over me? That's not fair. This was planned before we even met. And this client represents 15% of my revenue. If I lose them because I can't give them my full attention, they'd both said things they regretted, hung up angry, spent a miserable day apart before meeting at a Blue Bottle Coffee in Oakland the next morning to repair it. I'm sorry, Maddie said. I can't expect you to be constantly available just because my work is unpredictable. And I'm sorry for making it sound like your emergency wasn't important. Jake reached across the table. We need a better system. They created an shared Google Calendar, emergency codes versus normal requests, boundaries that protected both their work and their relationship. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. In week 3, Jake got an offer that tested everything. Tony walked into his office carrying a contract, his expression unreadable. Boss, you need to see this. Fleet maintenance contract from Tech Vision Solutions. 80 vehicles across the Bay Area. Premium rate. 3-year guarantee. Jake read the numbers and felt his stomach drop. $300,000 a year. Triple his current revenue. Enough to hire 10 more mechanics, expand to a second location in Berkeley or Hayward, transform his business from small shop to legitimate operation. The catch? Jake asked, because there was always a catch. 24/7 availability. Someone on call always for their Seattle executives visiting the Bay Area. They're demanding, but the money... Jake looked at Emily's photograph on his desk. Then at his phone, Maddie's last text visible. Miss you. Board meeting in SF ran late. Call when you can. He thought about 80-hour weeks, hiring people he didn't know, managing instead of fixing, becoming exactly what he'd never wanted to be, losing what made Morrison's auto repair his. Tell them no. Tony stared at him. Boss, do you understand what you're... I understand exactly what it is. Jake set the contract down. A trap dressed up as an opportunity. My uncle taught me in Sacramento that there's a difference between growing bigger and growing better. This is bigger, but it's not better. You're turning down 6 figures because of Maddie. I'm turning down 6 figures to protect what matters. I spent 6 years building walls so high nothing could hurt me. Then Maddie walked through my door and reminded me what it feels like to care about something beyond just getting through the day. Jake looked at Emily's photo again, feeling like he was finally honoring her memory instead of hiding from it. I'm not trading that for a fleet contract. 4 weeks after the vineyard weekend, Maddie called at 8 in the morning. Her voice sounded strange, nervous, excited, terrified all at once. I need to see you. Can I come by the shop? An hour later, she walked through the door carrying 2 coffees from Phil's. Jake was under a Ford Explorer, but he rolled out immediately, wiping his hands on a rag that was beyond saving. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. She was pacing, unable to stand still. I told the Seattle firm, no. Jake went very still. What? I turned down the acquisition. All of them, actually. Tech Vision, the Boston Group, everyone. I'm keeping Sterling Solutions. Maddie, that was $120 million. I know what it was. She stopped pacing, faced him directly. And I know what everyone will think. That I'm crazy. That I threw away the opportunity of a lifetime. That I let fear or you make my decision for me. Did I? No. She took his hands, and Jake felt how badly hers were shaking. I turned it down for me, because I finally figured out what success actually means to me. I built Sterling Solutions to prove I didn't need my family's empire. The acquisition offers proved that. I won. But accepting them would have been about proving something else, that I could play in the big leagues, become what my father wanted. Her voice was shaking now, but she kept going. I don't want to spend the next 5 years building someone else's vision. I don't want to relocate to Seattle or travel 3 weeks out of 4. I want to keep running my company on my terms, helping Bay Area clients, employing people I actually know. And I want to build a life that has space for you in it, Jake. Not as an afterthought, but as a priority." Jake pulled her into his arms and felt her cry against his shoulder, relief and terror and the weight of a choice that couldn't be unmade. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. "Really sure? I'm terrified I'll regret it, but I'm more terrified of waking up in 10 years having built an empire I don't care about while losing everything that actually matters." They stood like that for a long time, Tony and Marcus, pretending to work on the other side of the shop, but definitely listening. When Maddie finally pulled back, she was smiling through tears. "I have another idea, something we could build together." 8 months later, Jake and Maddie stood outside a shop in Sacramento, the city where Jake's uncle had fixed cars for 40 years. The building was modest, the neighborhood working class, the sign above the door, reading Garcia Auto Repair, a Morrison Foundation shop. Maria Garcia stood beside them, 42 years old, former Marine Mexican-American woman who'd been 2 weeks from closing her shop when the foundation found her. Her rates were too low to stay in business, but she couldn't raise them knowing her customers couldn't afford it. The Morrison Foundation had given her a way to survive while staying who she was. The grand opening was small. Families with old cars lined up, people who'd been quoted impossible prices elsewhere, who needed reliable transportation to get to jobs that barely paid rent. Maria's 2 new employees stood with her in clean uniforms, ready to work. Jake watched Maria diagnose a problem for an elderly woman with her teenage grandson, and he felt something profound shift in his chest. This was what purpose looked like. Not just maintaining his small Oakland shop, but expanding the impact of his values, building something that would outlast him. Maddie stood beside him, her hand in his. She'd restructured Sterling Solutions over the past 8 months, hired a COO, promoted key employees, implemented systems that let the company run efficiently without requiring her constant presence. She ran the Morrison Foundation, now handling fundraising and organization, while Jake vetted mechanics and established quality standards. They'd built something together, not by compromising who they were, but by amplifying what they cared about. Bill had written the seed check, $100,000, as an investor, not a controlling father. Patricia had joined the board, bringing connections to Bay Area philanthropic organizations. Derek had helped with legal structures. Vanessa, now divorced from Charles and dating a high school teacher from Boston, had become their champion with East Coast donors. The Sterling family had transformed. Not perfectly, there were still moments of old patterns creeping back, but genuinely. They'd learned to value authenticity over achievement, connection over competition. As the sun set over Sacramento, Jake and Maddie drove back to Oakland. She'd moved into his apartment 3 months ago, kept her place in San Francisco as an office, but home was above Mrs. Chen's restaurant. Home was where they built their life together. "You know what today was?" Maddie said as they crossed the Bay Bridge. "The first time in my life I've built something that matters more than the revenue numbers. How's it feel? Terrifying and perfect at the same time." They pulled up to the apartment, and Jake saw what he'd been hoping for, a package outside the door. Inside was a ring, simple American-made, exactly right. 3 years to the day after Maddie had first walked into his shop, Jake drove them to Napa Valley. The Sterling family wasn't there. He'd arranged that with Bill, just the 2 of them retracing the journey that had changed everything. They walked through the vineyard rows where Bill had given his blessing, sat on the terrace where they'd had the scary conversation about whether they could make it work, stood in the garden where Maddie had finally stood up to her family. As sunset painted the valley in gold and amber, Jake took her hands. "3 years ago, you walked into my Oakland shop and asked me to pretend to be your boyfriend for 1 weekend. You said you needed someone real." Maddie was already crying. "I remember." Jake pulled out the ring box, got on one knee. "I'm not asking you to pretend anymore. I'm asking because you're the person I want to choose every day. Because you taught me that caring about someone is worth the risk. Because building a life with you messy and complicated and beautifully imperfect is the best thing I've ever done. Madeline Sterling, will you marry me? Yes. God, yes. 6 months later, they married in Napa Valley. The ceremony was outdoors, vineyard backdrop string lights, sunset timing perfect. The guest list mixed family in formal wear with mechanics in suits they'd clearly rented for the occasion. Maria Garcia and her team from the Sacramento shop sat in the third row. Tyler, Sophie, and Jackson served as junior groomsmen and flower girl. Vanessa stood as maid of honor with her new boyfriend David, the high school English teacher, who loved her for herself instead of her pedigree. Tony, Marcus, and Jenny from Jake's Oakland shop sat in the front row wearing expressions of fierce pride. The vows were personal, honest. Maddie, I promise to keep choosing you. Every single day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. I promise to be your wrecking ball when your walls go up and your safe place when they come down. I promise to build a life with you that's measured not by what we accumulate, but by who we help and how we love. Jake, I promise to let you in. To trust that being seen is safer than being protected. I promise to choose authenticity over achievement, connection over control. I promise to build a life with you where success means waking up and knowing we matter to each other more than we matter to the world. At the reception, Bill stood to give a toast. His voice was thick with emotion Jake had never heard from him before. 3.5 years ago, my daughter brought home a mechanic from Oakland, and I thought she'd lost her mind. A man with grease under his fingernails, no interest in wealth or status, completely unimpressed by everything we'd spent our lives building. I was wrong. He paused, gathering himself. Jake didn't need to be impressed by what we'd built because he understood something we'd forgotten. My father taught me in Detroit that a man's worth is measured by his paycheck. I built an empire believing that lie. Jake taught all of us in one weekend that a man's worth is measured by what he does when nobody's watching, by who he helps when there's nothing to gain. Bill raised his glass. To Jake, who taught us to see clearly. To Maddie, who had the courage to demand better from all of us. And to the life they're building together, one honest choice at a time. Tyler stood spontaneously. I just want to say Jake gave me a summer job at his Oakland shop last year. And he taught me that working with your hands isn't something to be embarrassed about. It's something to be proud of. So, thanks, Jake, for showing me what real work looks like. The foundation mechanics from Sacramento, Los Angeles, Portland gathered around Jake afterward. Because of you, we're helping people across California. That matters. 10 years later, Jake and Maddie returned to the Napa estate with their daughter Emma, 7 years old, with dark, curly hair and her father's eyes. They walked through the vineyard where their story had unfolded, Emma skipping between them. Grandpa Bill says you're a hero, Daddy. Jake caught up to her. I'm not a hero, sweetheart. I just show up and do what needs doing. Grandma Patricia says that's what heroes do. They show up. The Morrison Foundation now supported 23 shops across 5 western states, California, Oregon, Washington, Arizona, Nevada. Thousands of families helped. Hundreds of mechanics mentored. Jake still ran his original Oakland shop now with 5 employees. Half his time went to fixing cars, half to mentoring shop owners across the region. Sterling Solutions thrived under Maddie's balanced leadership. She'd built exactly what she wanted. Successful company on her terms, meaningful foundation, work life that had space for family. The Sterling family gathered on the terrace, the same location where Jake had first faced their hostile judgment. But the atmosphere was completely different now. Bill and Patricia held hands, genuinely affectionate. Derek and Amanda had renewed their vows after marriage counseling. Tyler was home from UCLA grad school, still working summers at Jake's shop. Sophie was studying social work at Berkeley, inspired by the foundation. Jackson, 18 now, was applying to Jake's mentorship program because he wanted to be a mechanic. Vanessa sat with David and their 2 kids, genuinely happy in a life built on authenticity instead of aristocratic performance. After dinner, Emma tugged Jake and Maddie's hands. "Tell me the story again. How you met." They'd told it dozens of times, but it never got old. They sat with her on the terrace overlooking the vineyard. "A long time ago," Maddie began, "Mommy needed help. She was scared her family wouldn't understand her. So she walked into a shop in Oakland and asked a stranger for help. And Daddy said yes," Emma finished. "That's right. Not because I had to, not because there was anything in it for me, but because someone needed help, and showing up for people who need help is what matters most." Emma looked serious, processing. "Is that why you and Mommy help people with their cars through the foundation?" "That's exactly why. Because everyone deserves help. And the greatest wealth in the world isn't money or success or anything Grandpa Bill used to think mattered." "What is it?" Jake and Maddie answered together. "Showing up when you have nothing to gain." Emma considered this. "I want to show up for people too, when I grow up." Jake pulled her close, tears in his eyes. "My uncle taught me in Sacramento that heroes are just people who show up when nobody else will. You don't need to be special, you just need to care. And sweetheart, you already do. Will you teach me to fix cars?" "I'd be honored." Later, after Emma was asleep in the guest room, Jake and Maddie stood at the vineyard overlook the same spot where he'd proposed. The California sky was full of stars, the valley bathed in moonlight. "You know what I realized today?" Maddie said. "The greatest wealth in the world has nothing to do with money." "No," Jake agreed. "It's showing up when you have nothing to gain. It's choosing people over profit. It's building a life that matters." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Maddie smiled. "Emma asked me earlier if we could help more people tomorrow." "What did you tell her?" "That we could, that we would, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." Jake thought about the journey that had brought them here. A desperate woman walking into his shop 3 years ago. A weekend of family confrontation. Months of figuring out how to build something real across fundamental differences. Years of choosing each other consistently. Honestly, building a foundation that was helping thousands of people across the American West. He thought about Emily's photograph still on his desk in Oakland. About his uncle's Leatherman tool in his pocket. About the values passed down through generations, integrity measured by what you do when nobody's watching. And he thought about Emma, 7 years old and already understanding that showing up matters more than calculating outcomes. That was legacy, not empires or acquisitions or wealth measured in millions, but values passed down, lived out, shared with people who needed them. The Morrison Foundation would outlast him. The mechanics they'd mentored would teach others. The families they'd helped would remember that someone showed up when they needed it most. And Emma would grow up knowing that the greatest wealth in the world has nothing to do with money. As they walked back to the house hand in hand, Jake felt profound gratitude for the woman who'd walked into his shop asking for help. Who'd needed someone real and found someone willing to be exactly that. Who'd built a life with him that was messy and complicated and beautifully authentic. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose hope over fear, even when fear seems safer, especially when fear seems safer. And in the end, Jake thought as they climbed the stairs to where their daughter slept peacefully, that choice made all the difference. The Sterling estate lights went dark, one by one. In Oakland, Morrison's auto repair would open tomorrow morning at 7 sharp. In Sacramento and Los Angeles and Portland and Phoenix, foundation shops would serve customers who needed affordable help. Across the American West, mechanics who shared Jake's values would show up and do the work that mattered. Not for profit, not for recognition, but because some debts can only be paid with time and attention and giving a damn. And that Jake Morrison had learned from his uncle and taught his daughter and built into a foundation that would outlive them all was the only wealth worth having.